The sky ripped open with the roar of thunder, and the plains trembled beneath the weight of an unforgiving storm. Lightning carved jagged scars across the horizon, splitting night into violent fragments of light. A newborn calf collapsed into the dust, its breath shallow, its trembling limbs slick with the dampness of birth. Margaret, the mother, bellowed, "Stand, my child, you must stand or you will die." Hyenas stirred in the distance, their silhouettes flickering like shadows of hunger beneath the storm. James the hyena whispered to his pack, "The calf is weak, and weakness is ours to claim." Rain struck the earth like whips, mixing with the blood and soil beneath the calf's fragile body. Each second was a hammer, pounding urgency into the air. Margaret pressed her muzzle against the calf, urging it upward. The hyenas laughed in the dark, their voices low and cruel, circling like vultures with teeth. The world gave no mercy. The calf gasped once, then again, its chest heaving with primal desperation. Margaret said, "Breathe, child. Fight." The storm swallowed her plea, but the calf's eyes flickered open against the storm's fury. The storm showed no mercy as Margaret planted her hooves into the soaked earth, her body shaking from the effort of shielding the calf. The hyenas circled, their laughter mocking the fragile struggle. "James," said Patience, "we take them when they fall." The calf shivered, tiny legs twitching like reeds breaking in the flood. Margaret said, "You must rise, or the shadows will take you." Her voice thundered with desperation, but the storm drowned her plea. Lightning carved James' scarred face into a demon mask. Hunger glowed in his eyes, and the pack swayed closer with each roll of thunder. Margaret's breath came fast, her sides heaving, her strength stretched to its breaking point. The calf coughed, chest rattling as life fought against storm and predator alike. Margaret pressed down again, pushing her nose beneath the calf's belly. A gasp, a flinch, a shudder of limbs. Time slowed as both mother and calf trembled in the rain. The wind cut across the plains like blades, scattering grass in wild patterns. Margaret said, "Not yet. You cannot leave me." Her voice cracked between bellows and sobs. The calf quivered, his body jerking as though the storm itself struck him from within. James sneered, "See how it shakes, the feast trembles before us." The hyena's laughter rose above the storm, sharp and cruel. Margaret's muscles ached as she pressed tighter against the calf, her body a wall of resistance. The storm spat rain into her eyes, blinding her vision, yet she refused to yield. The calf's lungs rattled as air dragged in ragged bursts. Margaret said, "Stand, child, or this will be your last breath." Her plea echoed against thunder, against hunger, against fate itself. The calf twitched, hooves scraping shallow furrows in the mud. One breath more, one heartbeat more, and still, survival held by a thread. The sky growled, as if echoing the hunger of the hyenas. James said, "One stumble, one falter, and the calf is ours." The pack spread wide, their shadows stretching like claws across the drenched earth. Margaret braced, horns angled, her body trembling with exhaustion. Rain carved rivulets through her muddy coat, her chest heaving as her breath fogged the cold night. The calf whimpered, voice breaking like a dying reed in the storm. Margaret said, "I will not let them take you." Her resolve cut sharper than lightning, but her eyes burned with dread. The hyenas crept closer, their paws slapping softly against mud, forming a deadly ring. Thunder cracked above, and for one violent instant, predator, prey, and storm locked in silence. Then the calf twitched, struggling against weakness, his hooves digging shallow furrows into the earth. Life still fought, but death loomed close. The plains shook under thunder, but Margaret stood like a crumbling fortress. James hissed, "Let it weaken more. The storm will do half our work." His pack chuckled, their hunger tightening the circle. Margaret lowered her horns, eyes blazing as she growled, "Come and test me, but know I will bleed for him." Her body quivered with the strain, but her will was unbroken. The calf coughed again, his tiny body jerking forward in spasms of life clinging on. Lightning struck close, splitting the ground in a blinding blaze. The pack flinched, momentarily scattered, yet regrouped with laughter, sharper and more vicious. Margaret pressed again, her muzzle shoving at the calf's side. The calf gasped, lungs pulling in air like knives, hooves scraping weakly. The night was war, fought between a mother's love, a child's struggle, and shadows that would not wait forever. Dawn broke slowly, painting the soaked plains with bruised gold. Margaret stood tall but weary, her body shivering as the storm's fury faded into a heavy silence. The calf wobbled on fragile legs, each step trembling like glass. Margaret whispered, "Steady, little one. The world is cruel, but you must endure." James lingered at the edge of shadow, his scarred face half hidden by tall grass, hunger still etched in his eyes. He said, "The storm may fade, but weakness will not vanish." The calf coughed, ribs heaving as life fought against exhaustion. Margaret lowered her head, her nose pressing gently to his side, urging him forward with love and desperation. The land reeked of wet soil and fear, yet within the trembling calf there burned the smallest spark of defiance. Each breath carved a fragile thread between survival and loss, binding mother and child against the wilderness. The grass swayed under the gentle wind, but tension clung to the air like smoke. Margaret said, "Every step you take, my child, is a victory against death." Her voice was softer now, heavy with exhausted tenderness. The calf staggered forward, hooves slipping in mud, yet he refused to collapse. James muttered, "Look how it fights. Even weak flesh has spirit, but spirit feeds no hunger." The hyenas behind him shifted impatiently, their forms restless shadows under the fading storm clouds. Margaret's eyes burned with defiance as she guided the calf toward firmer ground, her body leaning protectively. The world had slowed, the violence of night replaced by the quiet terror of daybreak. The calf lifted his head, eyes wide with innocence, reflecting light like glass. Margaret's breath steadied as she said, "Hope begins with a single step." The horizon shimmered with heat as the storm clouds thinned, leaving behind the raw scent of earth. Margaret steadied her hooves, lowering her head to guide the calf with gentle nudges. The calf stumbled, legs shaking like reeds caught in a current, yet his eyes glimmered with something new, determination. Margaret said, "Feel the ground. Hold your balance. The land will carry you if you stand with it." James growled under his breath, "It rises, but every rise leads to a fall." The hyenas murmured agreement, shifting uneasily, torn between patience and hunger. Margaret ignored them, pressing her flank closer to her calf, shielding him with unwavering resolve. Her body trembled, her strength stretched thin, but her spirit remained unbroken. In that fragile moment, the calf's small frame seemed to rise taller against the endless horizon. The plains opened wide under a sky streaked with fading storm light. "Oh," Margaret said, "you are not alone. I will carry your fight in my blood." Her voice was low, steady, almost a vow to the earth itself. The calf leaned into her, small body pressing against her side, drawing warmth and courage from her trembling strength. James narrowed his eyes, his patience fraying as the calf's survival stretched longer than he expected. He snarled, "The weak delay, but cannot escape." His pack stirred, but he silenced them with a sharp glance. Margaret steadied her stance, every breath a promise that no predator would claim her child without a battle. The calf stumbled once more, then planted his hooves with sudden firmness, a spark of balance trembling in the air. Margaret's eyes glistened as she whispered, "Yes, my child, yes." The morning air shimmered with a fragile calm, yet every shadow threatened violence. Margaret stood motionless, her breath slow, her body trembling from fatigue but unyielding. The calf lifted his head higher than before, his eyes wide with innocence that seemed to pierce the hostile silence. Margaret said, "The world will not wait for you to grow strong. You must begin now." James tilted his head, his scarred face lit briefly by sunlight as he sneered, "Let it stumble, and its bones will be ours." The pack chuckled low, hunger echoing in their voices. The calf took a hesitant step, then another, legs shaking but refusing to collapse. Margaret exhaled, a deep, quivering sigh of both exhaustion and triumph. For the first time the hyenas faltered, their cruel laughter thinning into silence as hope took fragile root against their hunger. The sun climbed higher, but its warmth felt like a lie on the trembling plains. Margaret pressed close to the calf, her muscles aching from the long night's stand. The calf staggered, each step breaking like a fragile note in a brutal symphony. James growled, "The day is long, but hunger grows stronger with every beat." His pack answered with low snarls, circling wider in the tall grass. Margaret lowered her horns, her body a living wall, her breath hot and heavy. She said, "If you fall, they will tear you apart before you take another breath." The calf wheezed, legs stiff, his chest rattling with exhaustion. Dust clung to his slick coat, and every stumble shook Margaret's heart like thunder. James smirked. "Hope is a toy the weak cling to, but hunger does not play." Shadows stretched longer, and fear spread across the open ground. The air grew thick with heat, shimmering waves rising from the earth as predators drew nearer. Margaret's breath rasped, her hooves sinking into the cracked soil. She said, "Stand firm, my child, the earth itself must hold you." The calf lifted his head, eyes wide with a glimmer of fragile courage. James whispered to his pack, "It rises still, but each rise makes the fall sweeter." His voice curled like smoke through the grass. The hyenas moved with a hunter's rhythm, their bodies weaving through golden blades. Margaret's tail flicked sharply, warning them she would not yield, not even to the horizon itself. The calf stumbled forward, collapsing to his knees, dust spraying in thin clouds. Margaret bellowed, shaking the plains, her voice cracking with desperation. She pressed her body close, her shadow sheltering his trembling frame. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the sharp scent of blood across the plains. James inhaled deeply, his scar pulling tight as he sneered. The calf bleeds, the feast ripens. The hyenas snapped their jaws, eyes blazing in the sunlight. Margaret pressed against her calf, her horns poised, her body trembling with rage and fear. She said, "No teeth will touch him while I breathe." The calf coughed violently, red specks staining the dirt as his sides shook with effort. Margaret licked the calf's neck, each stroke desperate, as though she could will strength into his fragile body. The sky darkened slightly, storm clouds gathering once more, shadows racing across the golden earth. James chuckled low, the sky itself wants him gone. His pack echoed his laugh, the sound slicing like knives into the tense air. The first drops of rain returned, hissing as they struck the parched soil. Margaret lifted her head, rain streaking down her face, her chest rising like a crumbling fortress. She said, "Storm or predator, nothing will break us." The calf quivered, his hooves digging into mud, refusing to collapse again. James growled, "Rain hides blood, but it cannot hide weakness." His pack closed in tighter, their bodies slick with water, their eyes burning through the storm's veil. Margaret shifted, her horns gleaming under lightning, her body angled to block every path to her child. The storm cracked with thunder, shaking the sky and silencing the earth. The calf stumbled forward again, water splashing beneath his hooves. Margaret bellowed, her voice rising above storm and predator alike, her roar carrying into the void of the plains. The plains roared with thunder and hunger, two storms colliding into one. Margaret braced, her legs trembling, her breath ragged, yet her stance unbroken. She said, "Fight, child, fight, until the earth knows your name." The calf gasped, his fragile body shuddering with every breath, but his hooves pressed deeper into the mud. James howled, "The calf resists, but no calf outruns the shadows forever." His pack surged closer, their paws slapping against wet earth, hunger dripping from their snarls. Lightning split the sky above, striking close enough to send the ground shaking. Margaret lowered her horns, her eyes blazing with fire that not even the storm could drown. She pressed against the calf, guiding his trembling steps forward. Together they stood in defiance, a mother and her child against the endless tide of death. The storm eased, leaving a charged silence heavy as stone. Margaret leaned close to her calf, her breath steadying as she whispered, "The earth still holds us." The calf's legs wavered, but he refused to collapse. James stood at the edge of the circle, his scarred face half lit by a break in the clouds. His voice was softer now, almost human in its weariness. James said, "You think I hunt for cruelty, but my cubs starve as yours learns to breathe." The pack stirred uneasily, their hunger no less sharp, but their leader's words cracked the night like a second storm. Margaret froze, stunned at the revelation hidden in his growl. The calf blinked, his innocence reflecting not only fear but also a strange piercing understanding. A mother's fight for her child mirrored by a predator's desperate truth. Survival was never one-sided. The plain seemed to hold its breath as Margaret studied James, her nostrils flaring with confusion and rage. She said, "Your hunger does not excuse your teeth." James's gaze flickered toward the horizon where faint yelps echoed like ghosts. He said, "My young cry as yours trembles. Their bellies are hollow as the wind." His scar caught the light, not as a mark of power, but of survival's cruel price. Margaret shifted uneasily, her body still guarding the calf, yet her eyes betrayed the stirrings of doubt. The calf leaned weakly against her side, his breathing ragged, but his eyes locked on James, as though hearing more than words. The hyenas behind James snarled impatiently, their hunger louder than their leader's conflicted voice. The storm above dimmed, leaving shadows thick across the land, where truth stood raw and sharp as bone. A silence heavier than thunder stretched across predator and prey. Margaret said, "The law of teeth and blood is written in the soil, but must it claim us both?" James stepped forward, his body taut, his scarred muzzle drawn into something between a snarl and plea. He said, "I do not seek cruelty, I seek survival, as you do." His pack growled in discontent, eyes burning with hunger too wild for patience. Margaret's heart pounded as she pressed tighter against the calf, who blinked with fragile curiosity, sensing the tremor in both voices. For a moment, the air stilled, as though the land itself listened to the clash of truths. The calf coughed, a weak sound that seemed to slice the silence into fragile shards. Above, the clouds parted enough to reveal a sliver of sky, pale and hauntingly calm. The plains shifted, as if weighted by revelation. James' voice broke into a growl laced with fatigue. He said, "My cubs die while you guard life. Tell me, mother, how is your pain different from mine?" Margaret's chest heaved, her flanks trembling as her eyes burned with rage and sorrow. She said, "Because love does not excuse the taking of another." The calf pressed closer to her, his fragile frame trembling but steady, his wide eyes reflecting the predator's broken mask. The hyenas snarled louder, pulling the air into a dangerous edge, their hunger gnawing away at their leader's wavering resolve. James turned his face briefly away, his scar casting a shadow long as guilt itself. For the first time, predator and prey stood not as opposites but as mirrors of desperate survival, both broken under the weight of their roles. The land itself seemed to tremble with the weight of choice. Margaret whispered, "If your cubs hunger, then let them fight their war without mine." James' eyes narrowed, the scar burning red under the dim sun. He said, "Survival writes no mercy, yet mercy lives in me still." His words split the pack, some snarling in fury, others faltering in doubt. The calf wobbled forward a single step, his tiny hooves sinking in mud, his gaze fixed on the predator, who confessed more than hunger. Margaret bellowed, her voice filled with both fury and sorrow. "Then you are not only my enemy, but also my reflection." James lowered his head, torn between instinct and something deeper, while the pack shifted uneasily, restless between hunger and hesitation. The storm clouds above rolled darker, carrying the tension of truths that no teeth could erase. The storm returned with fury, tearing the sky into shards of lightning. Margaret braced, her horns lowered, her body quaking but unbroken. She said, "Come then, and bleed with me." The calf gasped, his fragile chest rising in ragged bursts. James snarled, No more waiting, no more mercy. His pack surged forward, claws tearing mud, teeth flashing in the storm's savage light. Margaret lunged, her bellow rattling the earth as her horns slashed the air. The first hyena shrieked, thrown sideways, blood and rain spraying in the darkness. The calf stumbled back, his legs trembling like reeds in a river, yet his eyes locked on his mother's defiance. Thunder crashed, drowning the cries of predator and prey alike. James drove forward, his scarred face twisted with hunger and grief. The clash erupted, raw, merciless, unstoppable. The plains became a battlefield of mud, blood, and lightning. Margaret struck again, her horns goring a hyena, tossing its body into the storm. James barked, "Press closer, take the calf while she bleeds." The pack obeyed, their snarls rising in a vicious chorus. Margaret's flank ripped open under sharp fangs, blood mingling with rain. She roared, a sound torn between agony and rage, and drove another hyena to the ground, crushing it beneath her hooves. The calf stumbled forward, crying weakly, his tiny body shivering as he tried to move toward his mother. Margaret bellowed, "Stay back. Your fight is to live." Her breath came ragged, her legs shaking, but her eyes burned with fire unbroken. James lunged again, his scar glowing red in the storm's fury. The storm howled like a beast as Margaret staggered, her blood trailing across the drenched soil. The calf cried, his tiny legs scraping furrows as he lurched toward her. James leapt, jaws snapping inches from the calf's throat. Margaret spun, horns slashing through rain, knocking James sideways in a spray of mud. She shouted, "Not my child, never my child." James rolled, scarred face, dripping with both blood and fury. He snarled, "Your strength cracks, and when it breaks, we claim both." The pack surged again, hunger turning them into a wall of teeth and claws. Margaret pressed closer to her calf, shielding him though her body sagged with exhaustion. Lightning struck close, blinding the world in white. The clash froze in a heartbeat of suspended terror before chaos resumed. The air reeked of blood and thunder, every breath a war cry. Margaret stumbled, her legs shaking, her flank torn deeper, but she refused to fall. She said, "If I must die, it will be standing." The calf pressed against her trembling body, his eyes burning with fragile fire. James circled, his scar gleaming, his voice rough with fury. He said, "Then fall with dignity, and feed what must live." The pack surged again, snapping, clawing, forcing Margaret into a ring of hunger. She spun, striking left and right, her body a storm within the storm. Hyenas screamed, thrown aside, but more replaced them, their hunger endless. Blood streamed from Margaret's wounds, streaking across her trembling ribs. She roared, defying both predator and fate, her voice breaking the sky itself. The climax tore across the plains like fire unleashed. Margaret lunged forward, her horns spearing one hyena and flinging it into the mud. She spun, kicking another backward, her body a weapon carved from agony. The calf stumbled forward, his legs shaking but refusing to collapse, his voice rising in a desperate cry that pierced thunder. James howled, his scarred face twisted into fury, and leapt for the final strike. Margaret lowered her horns, her eyes blazing with defiance as blood streamed down her side. She roared, "For him I endure!" The clash of horn and teeth split the storm, predator and prey colliding in a brutal, merciless explosion. Lightning tore the horizon apart, casting the battlefield in savage brilliance. The storm itself seemed to shudder at the weight of survival's final gamble. The storm broke apart, leaving silence heavy as stone. Margaret staggered, her body torn and slick with blood, yet she remained upright. The calf pressed against her trembling side, his tiny frame shuddering but alive. James lay in the mud, his scarred face lit faintly by the dying storm. His breath rasped, shallow and ragged, eyes clouded with exhaustion rather than hunger. Margaret whispered, "Still standing, still breathing. And that is enough." The calf coughed weakly, lifting his head higher than before, his eyes wide with fragile triumph. James growled low, his voice cracking, "Your fight burns longer than mine tonight." His pack lingered at a distance, scattered by lightning, unwilling to return. The plains exhaled. The violence soaked into earth and sky, leaving only weary survivors in its wake. The earth smelled of blood and rain, the battlefield painted with scars of survival. Margaret shook, her body nearly collapsing, yet her gaze never left the calf. She said, "You live, and that is victory." The calf took a step forward, hooves sinking deep into the softened ground, yet his legs did not fold. James coughed, spitting mud, his scarred muzzle twisting as he said, "The storm gave you strength, but storms always return." His pack whined faintly, their hunger stretched but not satisfied, their eyes hollow in the distance. Margaret lowered her head toward the calf, her breath warm against his damp coat, her strength poured into his fragile will. The wind shifted, carrying silence instead of snarls, a fragile stillness echoing through the plains. The plains stretched wide, empty yet scarred by violence. Margaret leaned heavily against the calf, her breath labored, her wounds oozing slow, rivers of red. She said, "Every step now is stolen from death." The calf wavered but pressed forward, his hooves dragging mud, yet carrying him upright. James lowered his head to the earth, his scarred eyes closing, his body sagging under defeat. His voice broke in a whisper, "Even predators fall to the same silence." The pack retreated further into shadows, their bodies fading into the tall grass, their hunger postponed by the weight of loss. Margaret raised her head once more, eyes blazing though her body trembled near collapse. Her bellow echoed across the plains, not in rage but in defiant survival, a sound carried into the empty dawn. The light grew stronger, streaking across the wounded land. Margaret swayed, her body breaking under exhaustion, but the calf stood straighter than before. She said, "You must carry this day into tomorrow." Her eyes closed briefly, her head lowering in weary surrender. The calf nudged her, his small body pressing against hers, a fragile pillar holding what once held him. James groaned, lifting his scarred face, his voice a rasp. He said, "Your defiance writes itself into the soil, and I will not forget it." His words faded as he slumped back into the mud, silence claiming him. Margaret opened her eyes, faint light reflecting in their depths, her breath thin but steady. The plains stirred, no longer a battlefield, but a grave for hunger's price. The world quieted, leaving only the breath of survivors and the echo of storm. Margaret trembled, her body scarred, her spirit fractured yet unbroken. She whispered, "Life clings, and so we endure." The calf stood beside her, his legs trembling but no longer collapsing, his wide eyes reflecting the dawn. James lay still, his scarred face half buried in mud, his breath shallow, his voice gone. The pack had vanished into the horizon, swallowed by tall grass and silence. Margaret lifted her head one last time, her eyes heavy yet defiant, her gaze fixed on the rising sun. The calf pressed close, his small frame leaning into her side, his survival a fragile miracle written against death. The plains stood eternal, witness to a battle lost and won, where life endured not with triumph but with inevitability. The sun rose higher, spilling gold across plains still scarred with mud and blood. Margaret stood trembling, her body barely holding her weight, yet her eyes burned with unbroken fire. She whispered, "You live, and so my battle is not wasted." The calf pressed against her, his small frame steady now, though his breath still rasped like brittle reeds. Silence spread wide, broken only by the soft hum of wind moving through wet grass. James lay motionless in the mud, his scarred face turned toward the horizon, as if even in defeat he stared beyond survival. Margaret exhaled slowly, her chest rising with pain and pride. The calf blinked, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon, where the light of day promised neither safety nor peace, only the demand to endure again. The wind carried away the last echoes of the storm, leaving the plains eerily quiet. Margaret swayed, her breath shallow, her wounds glistening in the dawn light. She said, "Pain is the cost of life, and I have paid enough. The calf lifted his head higher than before, his eyes reflecting the sun's pale fire. James' chest rose once, then fell again, his breath shallow, his voice silent. The horizon stretched endless and merciless, yet it held the fragile outline of survival etched into its soil. Margaret steadied herself, her hooves sinking into the softened earth, her gaze locked far beyond the predators and storms. The calf leaned closer, his fragile body becoming her strength. Together, they faced the horizon, their silence heavier than thunder, their presence an echo that would not fade. The earth lay still, yet memory lingered in every scar carved into the soil. Margaret whispered, "This place will remember our blood, though the sky forgets." The calf stumbled, then steadied, his legs stronger than they had been hours before. His eyes were wide, reflecting the battlefield as if carrying its weight into his small heart. James remained where he fell, his scar a dark mark upon his silent face. The pack was gone, swallowed by tall grass and distance, leaving only ghosts behind. Margaret closed her eyes, her breath slow, her body swaying, but her spirit still burning against the horizon. The calf pressed against her, guiding her as much as she once guided him. Together they moved forward, two fragile survivors walking across the scarred silence of the plains. The horizon shimmered with heat as the morning grew. Margaret's breath rattled, her body heavy with the weight of every wound, yet her eyes burned with something fierce. She said, "Carry this day, little one, for it will carve your soul." The calf blinked, his gaze sharp and unblinking, no longer a newborn, but a survivor etched in blood and storm. Silence filled the plains, heavy and eternal, as though the earth itself bowed to their endurance. James lay unmoving, his scar now only a memory of hunger's cost. The pack's absence was louder than their snarls had ever been, a void left by hunger denied. Margaret lifted her head toward the sun, though her body trembled near collapse. The calf leaned close, their shadows stretching long across the scarred earth, a testament carved in silence. The plains stood eternal, scarred yet unyielding, bearing witness to life's fragile defiance. Margaret whispered, her voice fading into wind, "We endure, even when all else is lost." Her body quivered but remained upright, her eyes reflecting the burning sun. The calf pressed close, his small frame carrying a weight larger than the horizon itself. James lay still, his scarred face frozen in silence, the shadow of hunger gone. The pack was nothing but memory, their absence an echo stretched across the plains. The wind whispered through grass, carrying no laughter, only silence. Margaret closed her eyes, her breath faint, her strength nearly gone, but the calf stood steady. His cry split the dawn, sharp and unforgettable, piercing silence like lightning. The world stilled, echoing that single sound, life's final defiance etched into eternity.